Today we are reviewing accidentals of all varieties. There's some new information, there's some review information, but it's new stuff that you need to be able to move forward from here. So this is actually a really important conversation, especially when we get to half steps and whole steps, because all of our harmony, chords, scales, all of that stuff is based on whole steps and half steps. So if you understand that, it will go a long way to helping you understand everything else that's going to happen the rest of this semester and things that we're going to talk about. So let's start by talking about sharps, flats, and naturals, okay? So an accidental is anything that alters the pitch, that changes it either up a half step, down a half step, or cancels one of those things out. So our musical alphabet, if we think about just the letters themselves, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, on the keyboard, those look like the white keys, okay? So just the letters are the white keys. Here's an A. Here's B, C, D, E, F, G, A. Okay, so my letters are just white keys. If you don't see anything else, you don't see a sharp or flat, it's representing those, okay? And obviously if you don't play piano, it represents pitches, those pitches, not just, because we don't always think in terms of white keys, but this is a really good visualization for learning half steps and whole steps. So if you think in terms of the keyboard, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second, that's helpful, okay? So in terms of the piano, the alphabet is our white keys, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Accidentals are going to alter the pitch. Accidentals can be black or white keys, and I'll show you that in a second here. So a sharp, if you see a sharp before a note on the staff or in the key signature, right? That tells us we're going to change that pitch by moving it up a half step. Okay, if you hear someone say, oh, this so-and-so sung that sharp, okay, it means they were a little bit above the pitch. Okay, so if we see a sharp in front of it, it's going to move it up a half step. So for example, if I have D, and then I have a sharp to change it, so now it's D sharp, it's no longer this pitch, that's just regular old D. If I want D sharp, I'm going to move up to the very next note on the keyboard. Okay, it's a different pitch that's being represented. Same thing, here's G. So I go up a half step to G sharp, that's the note I'm representing. Now what happens if I have something like, I don't know if you can see this, but here's B. Okay? If I say, and I'll show you this on the keyboard, on the board here in a second. If I say B sharp, it's not a black key, because the very next key to it, a half step up, is another white key. So this is actually B sharp. It's got another name, and those are enharmonics. We'll talk about that in a second. So it could be a black or a white key. Flats do the same thing, just in the opposite direction. So it's going to move it down a half step. If here's A, but I actually want A flat, I want the very next note that's lower. Okay, that's a half step away. And a natural, if you see a natural in front of a note, it's going to cancel out any sharps or flats that existed before that. So like, let's say there's a sharp in the key signature, but you see a natural in front of that note somewhere in the music, it's telling you, nope, don't play it sharp this time. Play the regular, just the letter name, okay? So a couple things to know when we're talking about accidentals. This is a rule that maybe some of you don't know. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. If a pitch is altered in a measure, so I'm not talking about in the key signature. Key signature, it's there all the time. But if in a measure, it's different than it usually is. So like, let's say normally C is natural in the key that you're playing in, but somewhere in the measure you see a C sharp, okay? Every C after that, in that measure, the measure is between two bar lines, right, is going to continue to be sharp unless you see a natural in front of it. So they continue for the rest of that measure. When you get to the bar line, it resets and goes back to normal, whatever is in the key signature. But if there's an alteration made in a measure, it carries through the rest of that measure, unless you see something else to change it. So that's an important thing to know. We'll see that in examples later on, not this week so much, but you'll see that in music, and we'll talk about that later. But it's a really important rule to know. Okay, so here's that keyboard up here, so we can see it a lot nicer than me playing it here. Okay, so for example, when I was talking about G, here's G. Up a half step, here's G sharp. Down a half step, here's G flat. Now it doesn't show it on here, but here's B. You can see B flat, that's the next half step lower. B sharp is actually this key, okay? And you can start to see that all of these notes can have more than one name. We call that enharmonics, okay? So a pitch that is spelled enharmonically is the same note, right? This note on the keyboard doesn't change pitch just because it's written A flat or G sharp. It could be either, usually it depends on the key signature, how it's written in the music or the chord itself. So just know that sometimes there's more than one way of representing the same pitch, the same note, okay? Those are called enharmonics. So like I said, B sharp could also be called C. That's its enharmonic spelling, okay? Questions about that so far? Because that's something that kind of like is abstract, but this helps to make it a little bit more visual, okay? When you see it on the page, it's a lot harder when you see it like on the staff. Okay, so that brings us to something called double sharps and double flats. Yes, these are real things. You don't see them nearly as often, but they do exist. And a lot of times you'll see them in certain key signatures specifically, especially if they have a lot of sharps or a lot of flats, you'll see them more often. So a double sharp looks like this. Double flat is like less creative, they just put it twice. Okay, so that's a double flat. Double sharp looks like an X. And they just move in an extra half step. So if I go back to this page, if I see an F double sharp, okay, so F double sharp somewhere. So here's F. F sharp is at one half step away. F double sharp is the next half step.
So it just makes the whole step.
Correct. Yep, it just moves it 2 half steps instead of 1. And like I said, it'll depend on the key signature. Trust me that there's a reason that it's there, but you don't see it a ton, right? It gets confusing, and I don't want to confuse people with like why we do it yet. We'll hopefully get to that part, but yeah, it just moves it a whole step. So they could technically write it as G, but there's a reason that they don't. And it's usually because G is also sharp in that key signature, and so then you end up having to put a natural in front of it anyway. It's just easier to put the double sharp there, okay?
There you wish that it wasn't.
What's that?
Except for when it's there, you wish that it wasn't.
Yeah, I know. It does. It makes your brain pause because we don't use it nearly as often. So that's what a double sharp does. A double flat would do the same thing, just in the opposite direction. Just move it down 2 half steps instead of 1. Okay? Questions about double sharps or double flat? Cool. Okay. So another way of saying 2 half steps is to say a whole step, and that's what we're getting into now. Whole steps and half steps. Now this isn't on your sheet if you're doing the basic version, but this is where we're headed to, so it's still something that you need to know. So a half step is the very next pitch. It's like a sharp or a flat away, right? So if I have F, a half step is going to be the very next note close to it. That's F sharp. Another half step away would be E. So they're both a half step apart. It doesn't matter if it's a white key next or a black key next. Okay? A whole step is simply 2 half steps. So, for example, if here's my F, and I want to go a whole step away from F, I'd go half step, half step. So there's going to be something in between. So G is a whole step away from F. Raise your hand when you know what note is a whole step below F. What would be a whole step below F? Raise your hand when you've got it. I'll give you a second to think about it. Whole step below F. And know that there's more than one right answer because we have enharmonic spelling. Alexis. Good, okay. So here's F, half step, E flat, or D sharp. So you could also say F double flat, right? That would be another way of saying that. So it's got a bunch of different ways of saying that note. F, F flat, F double flat. So you've got some options when you're writing names of things. I won't mark them wrong. Usually there's a choice that's a better choice for reasons that we won't get into, but just know that I won't mark it wrong if you use the enharmonic spelling right now, okay? So whole step, half step gets to be a little bit confusing for some people, but this is a really important concept for scales and for chords, which are going to be coming up, okay? Because you end up having to count whole steps and count half steps. Questions about whole steps and half steps? I know we're moving kind of fast. I want to give you a little time to work on that today in class, so if you have questions, I can help you. Okay, and last thing I want to show you, you'll all be getting a copy of this soon. When we start getting into accidentals within music, you end up needing different hand signs than just these, because they don't represent things in between, right? So this chart shows you all of the hand signs for the stuff that happens in between. So for example, here's re, right? Do, re. If re was flat, if it was a half step lower, you'd have ra, which looks like this. Okay? Instead of sol, if it was a half step lower, so this is showing what's lower. If you had something a half step lower than sol, it'd be sa, which is like this. If you have a half step higher than sol, you'd end up with si, which is like this. So you can see all of the things that are in between. I don't expect you to have these memorized. That's why you're going to get a copy of them. I don't have them memorized. I don't use them that often. But it is something that we'll need to know in certain instances in our music. Okay? So yeah, you'll get a copy of that. We'll start using it in some of our sight singing examples. Okay, questions? That was the fast, furious review of sharps, flats, naturals, double flats, double sharps, whole steps, half steps, chromatic solfege. Okay? All right, we'll end this.